The Piano Trio is an ensemble that's fascinated me for as long as I can remember. It's got a kind of raw, stripped-back quality that's always appealed to me, but unlike many of the other standard ensemble groupings, it's very temperamental and difficult to balance, which can make it a big challenge to write for. It also suffers a little from the perception that its heyday was during the late classical and romantic periods. In other words, that it's a bit of a relic. That its day is done. Its goose is cooked. Piano Trio, your goose is cooked. But this isn't a universally held opinion, and I certainly don't share it. I think every composer should attempt to write a piano trio for themselves, despite the fact that when you begin, it's hard not to feel the weight of its history leaning on you. A history you either honour, reject, or try to bargain with in some way. So when I got the opportunity to write for the renowned Fidelio Trio, who performed it at the National Concert Hall in Dublin last year, I myself had to negotiate with this history and tradition before making my own choices about where I wanted to take it. I think this process is fascinating and I wanted to share it with you. So this video is kind of a history, sort of a recommended listening list, and also an insight into my own writing process. The name Piano Trio can seem misleading to the uninitiated because it seems to imply, a bit like the piano concerto, that the piano is the lead or primary instrument of the group. But that's not the case at all. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the genre is that the three instruments, the piano, the violin and the cello, are treated as equals, with the substance of the music being carried evenly between them. And the story of how this concept of equality came about is key to understanding the genre as a whole. So, as everyone knows, prior to the widespread adoption of the piano, which began in the late 1700s, the harpsichord was the dominant keyboard instrument in Renaissance and Baroque music. However, its lack of dynamic power and expressiveness meant that it was often relegated to an accompaniment role, usually as the provider of chord progressions in the background, also called continuo playing, to support the peacocky solo instruments who get all the attention. But as the late Baroque period progressed, composers began to experiment by giving the harpsichord moments that stood out more prominently in the musical foreground. Parts that are of musical interest are often referred to as obbligato parts, as in obligatory, meaning specifically that the part cannot be left out because the piece requires it to make musical sense. Johann Sebastian Bach started assigning the harpsichord occasional obbligato parts around the 1720s. At this stage, the specific instrumentation of the trio had not really solidified either. For example, it was common for the flute to be proposed as a suitable alternative to the violin, for the convenience of the ensemble in question. In fact, in many cases the flute was specified as the preferred instrument, but regardless of this, the harpsichord's role was just about always secondary, stuck solidly in accompaniment mode. Then, towards the middle of the 18th century, a new way of thinking about the harpsichord developed in Paris, pioneered by composers like Jean-Joseph de Mondonville, where the standard roles were reversed, with the harpsichord becoming the solo instrument and strings accompanying instead. And bear in mind that at this stage it was more common for there to be one string instrument rather than two, an arrangement that eventually became known as the accompanied sonata. One notably awkward problem with the accompanied sonata, though, was the weakness of the harpsichord's dynamic capabilities compared to the much louder strings. When advising players on how his accompanied sonatas should be performed, the composer Louis-Gabriel Guillamant wrote about the string parts. They require an extreme softness of execution in order for the harpsichord itself to be heard readily. And even though this concern about balance was never satisfactorily resolved, the accompanied sonata exploded in popularity, not least because the simplicity of the string parts made them ideal for amateur performers wishing to play together at social events. In fact, it's likely that this social aspect actually helped to reinforce the subservience of the string parts as an established fact of the format. However, over time, composers began to loosen the strict roles that each instrument played, to the point where you couldn't really define any as simply an accompaniment instrument anymore. For example, listen to this moment of relative equality in Johann Christian Bach's 6 sonatas for harpsichord and violin. Moments like this began to appear in his trios too, where the string parts occasionally emerged to contribute obbligato material. but these moments are fleeting, and one important thing to note is that the cello part is still largely subservient, either doubling the bass line of the piano or the melodic parts played by the violin. And you may have noticed in that last example that the harpsichord has now given way to the forte piano, a precursor to the modern piano. More about this development in a moment. Another important development here is Johann Christian Bach's instructions that the flute not be used as a substitution for the violin, another little step in the direction of the ensemble we know today. Then between 1763 and 1764, a decisive moment for the piano trio occurred when a German composer called Johann Schobert, who was popularizing the accompanied sonata in Paris, came into contact with Leopold Mozart, who introduced him to his son, the then 7-year-old child prodigy Amadeus. Schobert made a big impression on young Mozart, who immediately set about writing some accompanied sonatas of his own. Now, Mozart has been described as the man who brought together the two remaining pieces of the puzzle to make what the author Basil Smallman calls the definitive breakthrough in the piano trio genre. The more obvious piece of this puzzle relates to the piano itself. Mozart had been fascinated by this emerging instrument, and after discovering an advanced model created by Johann Andreas Stein and Anton Walter, which was a significant improvement on previous models, he began writing music that could take advantage of its ability to jump from very soft to very loud dynamics in an instant. The second piece of the puzzle is Mozart's and Haydn's central role in the development of the classical style. Specifically the idea that music could be structured by setting up opposing musical themes, which intertwined and eventually resolved over the course of a movement. This new approach to musical development, which Haydn had already pioneered for the string quartet, worked best when the thematic material was equally distributed between all three instruments in the ensemble. To see how this works in closer detail, let's look at Mozart's piano trio in G major, composed in 1786, a piece many scholars identify as the first fully formed piano trio work, where all three instruments share equal responsibility for the thematic development of the music. Listen to the opening musical statement played by the piano, and I'll mark out a few moments of interest that I want you to pay attention to. So in this opening musical statement, we can pick out little patterns or motifs that keep reoccurring. Two obvious ones in this segment are and also. You also have a consistent Alberti bass technique played by the left hand, and this sits in the background with the motifs solidly playing in the foreground. This material offers the building blocks that the rest of the movement is going to be constructed from, and there are lots more than just two notable motifs being used, by the way. Every part of these opening 4 bars is used continuously throughout the piece. So when the strings join, the violin is the first to enter into a dialogue with the piano, and we can hear these two motifs popping up all over the place. Apart from the reuse of material, this idea of an imitative dialogue is itself an aspect of piano trio music that would be greatly developed by successive composers. You might remember a minute ago I mentioned the idea of opposing themes. Well, everything we've heard so far relates to the first theme, which is a consistently carefree feeling to it. But there's also a second theme, which is slightly more pensive and suspenseful sounding. So after this second mood is established, the rest of the movement progresses by exploring both musical ideas. The opening motif we heard earlier has now absorbed this slightly darker mood, and the cello finally has its first moment in the musical foreground. Now, being an early classical music example, these two different themes aren't really blended together all that much, and they largely develop on their own separate tracks until the end. Over time though, this practice of combining starkly different musical ideas would become central to the structure of many classical pieces, leading to what we now call sonata form. I'm not going to delve too much into sonata form here. The important point to note is that this idea of taking completely different sounding motifs and smashing them together, combining and twisting them in every way imaginable, is a major influencing factor on the need for equality between the instruments in the piano trio, because, to put it simply, all hands were needed on deck to explore every musical possibility, and an accompaniment instrument just can't do very much exploring. Beethoven would go on to greatly broaden the scope of the piano trio, writing much grander symphonic-length pieces. For example, his Archduke Trio, arguably the most famous piano trio of all, contains 4 movements. The first movement is just so great and features such an engrossing blend of light, twinkly ideas with dark, moody as hell ideas. One of my favourite examples is how he takes this almost cliched sounding passage, which feels like it's nearing the end of its rope, and drives it completely off the grid. And throughout the piece, it's clearly evident how each instrument participates equally in the unfolding of the musical material. It's almost like a Sudoku puzzle, with all 3 relentlessly hopping back and forth between foreground and background duties. As the classical period passed into the Romantic period, the piano trio repertoire began to greatly expand, and it's certainly not possible to cover this expansion in a single video. Instead, I want to mention strategies and techniques that composers employed when writing for the ensemble, and I'll mention a few notable works as I go, sticking in roughly chronological order. The first thing to mention is that with the Romantic period comes an emphasis on long melodic passages. An obvious consequence of this is the tendency to give each instrument their, let's say, moment in the sun, playing a melodic line in the foreground while the others provide backup. And I'll just issue one pro tip here. Although Tchaikovsky's trio is really great, I'd encourage young composers watching not to rely on this approach. If overdone, it can lead to music that sounds pretty stilted and dull, especially because melody is probably the most exploited resource in music. But if you are a melody person, one complementary technique is to momentarily group 2 instruments to sound like they're a single voice. For example, you can do that with the strings by matching the rhythm. Combined, this can give a fuller, more harmonically rich sound that can compete effectively with the piano. And this actually brings me to one of the major reasons why the piano trio is so tough to write for. It's a very imbalanced ensemble. In terms of dynamics, the piano is easily able to drown out the sound of the others. In addition, it's not exactly clear what the natural role of each instrument is. Compare it to a string quartet, for example, where the default ranges are obvious. But since the piano has a much lower range than the cello, which, as a result, can't really be considered the automatic bass instrument, it can also compete pretty effectively with the violin in the upper registers too, although the violin can still go a little bit higher. Not to mention the obvious problem that the piano can play loads of notes at once and, unlike the strings, sounds louder when it does so. This is another reason why composers will often employ the technique of doubling the strings for a more effective melodic dialogue. But this imbalance is also one of the reasons why it's so interesting. It's tricky to do each instrument justice while driving forward the musical development, and in some of my favourite examples, you often get the feeling of a tightrope walk, with each instrument vying for attention. And this imbalance is partially one of the reasons why it can sound so intensely dramatic too, because the strings often really need to push to be heard. All 3 instruments are capable of extreme softness too, as exemplified by Ravel's piano trio in A minor. As the 20th century progressed, further exploration of these techniques produced all kinds of emotional effects. Here, Hendrik Andriessen achieves a unique type of creepiness, partially due to the ghostly impressionistic piano, which provides a harmonic and textural background that still leaves enough space open for a harsh, never quite at ease string duet to take place in the foreground. Strong dissonance also seems to work particularly well with this ensemble, especially because of the complementary scratchiness that chamber music can provide. This then takes me to my favourite piano trio of all, one of the most dramatic and powerful pieces in the repertoire. I've already discussed this piece in detail on my video about Dmitri Shostakovich, so if you are interested, you should check that out. It's just a wonderful piece of work from start to finish. Naturally, throughout the 20th century, composers continued exploring various new ways to approach the trio. Here are some notable examples. So let's pause for a moment here and think about the problem facing composers tasked with writing a piano trio today, bearing in mind this legacy of development and experimentation I've just described. It can weigh on people. One thing that often occurs to me about this legacy is that when I'm trying to write a new piece of music, I don't really feel like a new composer. In many ways, I feel like an incredibly old composer because I have access to a much longer historical memory than, say, Mozart or Shostakovich, and as a result, more avenues for experimentation with the piano trio are closed off to me than was true for them. This is why many composers today avoid the standard classical arrangements, symphonies, violin concertos, piano trios, etc., not just because they want to explore different textures and sounds, but also because they don't want to be burdened by the history of these ensembles. In my opinion though, it's fun and instructive to sometimes work within these confines. So when the opportunity to write for the Fidelio trio presented itself, I took it, and then I had to approach the problem of the writing process. Given everything I've just described up to this point, what legacies did I honour, and how did I apply my own stamp on things? Well, the first thing to mention is the Fidelio trio themselves, a world-renowned group with an impressive catalogue of albums, having worked with some of the world's leading composers. And their skill levels are just through the roof, which is interesting because as a composer, it's tempting to take advantage of that skill by writing something unbelievably challenging. However, I avoided this impulse myself and ended up writing something quite technically simple in order to focus their attention on technique, expression and pacing, rather than on brutally fast or complex passages. It's not true that by writing simple music you're wasting the talents of superb players, because they'll be able to bring something to your piece that less experienced players just won't be capable of. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Regarding the issue of legacy, I find the best way to improve yourself as a composer is to learn as much as you can in order to expand your musical vocabulary, which in turn strengthens your intuition and creativity. But when writing, you need to put history to one side and forget about legacy completely. Just start working on ideas and the rest will come later. In my case, after a lot of experimentation, I landed on this little moment, which eventually became the opening few bars of my piece. Let's start there, and then I'll show you how I built it out into a finished work. Now that I had this idea, I needed to figure out how to proceed. Since this music is non-programmatic, meaning there are no specific ideas that I'm trying to represent, I didn't look at the outside world for inspiration. I just delved into the music itself to figure out what I liked about it. So let's start there. The bass blocks of the music, which are the patterns and the layering. This is where many of the things I focused on earlier in this video will come back into play. First, there's the tremolo in the strings, which I've asked to be played in a dry and robotic way. Then there are the interruptions to that pattern. I think of these as interjections, and I swap them constantly between the instruments. The next and probably most obvious pattern is the steady, high-pitched chords played by the piano right hand. And lastly, there's what I'm calling the melody chords, played on the left hand of the piano, which stand out because they're syncopated, never quite landing at the same time as the right hand. In the introduction, it's the harmony and syncopation of these chords that drives the music forward. You'll also notice that we have three fairly identifiable layers too. The string tremolo is in the background, the high-pitched piano chords are arguably in the midground, and the melody chords are standing out pretty clearly in the foreground due to the musical interest they provide. Now it's worth mentioning that I didn't set out to establish these layers, I just noticed they were there and then continued to manipulate them constantly throughout the piece. For example, this tremolo pattern at one point gets moved to the foreground on the piano. And here they are again on the piano, but quadrupled in length. And here's a moment later where the melody chords get moved to the strings. These decisions came about gradually as I investigated the music I'd written, and I think that's possibly the most important point here. I didn't start with rules. I started with something I liked and figured out the rules that made them work as I progressed. Now, the main difficulty I had was figuring out how to develop the music past the initial idea you heard at the start. When you create a really rigid pattern like this, the ear expects it to persist, and if you're not careful, you can find yourself locked in without too many avenues for escape. The harmonic arrangement also felt slightly locked in due to the repetitive tremolos in the strings and the consistently ambiguous piano chords. Any attempts I made to suddenly change either the rhythm or the harmony sounded awkward, so I instead tried to gradually morph them over time. And after some experimentation, I landed on a concept that helped me to do this. The best description I think I can give it is musical inertia. Essentially, I tried to keep each instrument doing the same thing for as long as possible until I felt it just had to change before it got boring, and any changes I made would be as minimal as possible in both the rhythm and the harmony. And I tried not to have changes happening at the same time either, and I actually found that if you made a small change to what one instrument was doing, it kind of bought you a bit of time before you needed to make changes elsewhere. The string tremolo in particular offered me two different ways to exercise musical inertia. First, I could just change one of the two notes rather than both, And second, I could stagger the changes made to the cello and the violin so they never happened at the same time. And in this way the harmony gradually morphs, never suddenly changing and never feeling too weird despite dipping occasionally into very dissonant territory. Also, regarding harmony, I want to draw your attention to that high-pitched chord in the piano. You'll probably have noticed that throughout the segment we just heard, it stayed consistent despite the gradual harmonic change happening everywhere else. And yet it didn't really seem to interfere with the harmonic change at all. This is a textural trick that works really well in the very high registers, where the frequency is so distant from the main harmonic development, it stands slightly apart from it, more like a percussion instrument, a bit like a small anvil. Even in traditional harmonic analysis, this is referred to as a pedal point, a persistently repeated chord that doesn't interfere with the harmonic progression because the ear has become reconciled to it. These chords also function as a kind of navigation point throughout the piece. Listen to this moment halfway through, where I've very sparsely arranged each of the patterns I talked about earlier. This is probably the best example of musical inertia that happens anywhere in this piece. Then, on the other hand, when the music approaches moments of climax, the inertia is still there but weaker, and the music changes at a much faster pace. Also notice in the cello my use of the open C string, which is its lowest note. I couldn't resist lingering on that note because it just sounds so powerful. The structure of this piece is very simple. It's a single movement piece around 8 minutes long which explores 3 distinctly different organizations of the musical elements I described earlier. If you support me on Patreon, you can download the full piece and the score too, and the parts are available on request. Before I show you the final moments of this piece, I want to first thank the Fidelio Trio for their collaboration, especially after hearing so many of the recordings over the years. I've linked to some of these recordings in the description below, and if ever you get the opportunity to see them, trust me, take it. I mentioned earlier that the benefit of having players of this caliber is that they can make something really simple sound amazing, but they can also help free you as a composer too. For example, in the final moments of this piece, I considered trying an organization of the patterns you heard earlier in a way that I worried was maybe a little capricious and unnatural, but when the Fidelio Trio got their hands on it, they just completely legitimized it. So, regarding the legacy of the piano trio, my own feeling is that the question of relevance is really down to what type of musical challenge you want to take on next. It's an entirely different kind of challenge to lock yourself into an established ensemble type and to try to find ways to be creative within those confines. But it's worth remembering that my very swift history of the ensemble is not an assertion of rules or values that people should stick to. The value of musical history is not in setting up structures that need to be idolized, but to enjoy watching how our creative ancestors approached musical problems in their own era. Never let anyone tell you that learning about the past is a waste of time, or that any type of musical arrangement, no matter how ancient, is incapable of being reimagined for modern audiences. Oh, and just before I go, I should mention that I now have a Discord server where topics like this come up all the time. It's been moderated by some very conscientious and dedicated people who I can't thank enough, and if you're going to pay us a visit, come soon, because we're about to launch a Jankman competition. Remember Jankman from that one video? Come, let's talk about Jankman.
If you like my diatribe, subscribe!
Jankman!